Hello, good evening. How are we doing? Welcome to the Cape Independence, a little podcast where we chat politics as casually and as unseriously as possible. This is Slow Politics. And before we get going on the main themes of the evening, I just thought I'd just mention something that was on. Leo, you're feeding back. Or am I feeding back? Oh, I'm feeding. I know what's happened. I had the YouTube page open in another tab. That is entirely my fault.
You're letting your age show, Rob.
No, I'm a millennial, but spiritually I'm a boomer. Anyway, what happened was that recently we had Iqbal Survey has managed to shoot himself in the foot. And what he's done is, for the umpteenth time, he's gone after Iqbal Survey. And Iqbal Survey, he's gone after Gulam, the anonymous little Twitter
yes,
account,
yes,
Black Circle,
probably one of the bigger account, well, one of the biggest accounts on South African Twitter at this moment. Yeah,
that's correct. That's correct. And what happened is that they got the wrong guy again. So some poor little Indian fella from Rylands or whatever has now got to deal with death threats from the ANC and so on. And hello, one person who is viewing. By the way, I have to say that I think the reason that we're getting the low view count compared to the others is primarily because I started posting on the actual Cape Independent YouTube channel for the first time today, whereas beforehand it was all on my own YouTube channel, which already has a following. But yeah, we've got to pitch the official channel, I'm afraid. At any rate, although there is a third option, I will discuss later. For now. One of the things that it just strikes me as absolutely insane that this guy is still in charge of such a large media house. I mean, the man has no ability to pay back debts. I don't know why. What was the union he borrowed the money from that he didn't pay back? It was one of Kasatu's subsidiaries.
was it? It wasn't NUMSA, was it?
No. It wasn't a mining union. It was like Satawu or something. But I don't know how they didn't sue him. I mean, the guy, okay, yes, of course, is important to controlling the narrative and blasting the DA, blah, blah, blah. But how are we letting this guy keep the Cape papers? I mean, surely by now, the kind of shenanigans the man runs, they've got to get rid of him. I mean, this would be a great one for AfriForum to take on. An absolutely great one for AfriForum to take on, because the main problem that they have at the moment is just this constant barrage of negative media attention. And the quickest way that you can deal with that is all of those big balloons that are throwing shade at you, just pop them. Every now and again, they're going to make some kind of major error, and if you give them enough of a clap, then some of their smaller subsidiaries will shake loose, and you get to scoop them up. I mean, this is an interesting point, because News 24 is liquidating the Beeld and the Burger, and then one other paper, I can't remember. And these are actually, their print division is profitable, these papers.
I didn't realize such a thing existed in 2024.
Right, the print. I mean, this is the thing about South Africa, is we still read print newspapers here, right? And those Afrikaans papers, the print editions, are still profitable. And somehow, News 24 decided this shit has got to go. I mean, this is old news now. This is not this week. This is a couple of weeks ago. So, I've been gently nudging the idea on Twitter for a while now that actually Solidarity and Marilla Media and whatever, they should see whether they can scoop up the IP for these these papers, because it would be very good. I mean, they also own some really exotic assets, like South Africa House in the Netherlands is owned by, I think it's the Burger, I'm not sure. But they own this thing called South Africa House, and it's like a big media library and, normal book library, academic papers, journals, all that. And so it has like this big cultural role, big cultural value. Fantastic post to open up if you're going to do the overseas, money collection thing that the Afrikaner Institute is doing.
That's exactly what they should be aiming for and what they are aiming for.
Right. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, drop my cancer stick. There we go. But I mean, this is the thing. It's very hard to get a profitable media house going. If you've got profitable, why are you closing them down? I mean, the only thing that I can think they're any good for is that they see it as more streamlined to make everything just News 24. They have this idea that there's just like one single channel to get your news from. It's just like a total monopoly. But the problem with that is if you have a very visible monopoly, you create problems, because then you're eventually going to run into state regulations regarding monopolies, and you expose yourself also to political interference. Not that News 24 ever lets itself be politically interfered with.
No, completely 100% reporting, non-partisan every time, as we've been told.
No, but there's actually some good statistics. So there's this. I don't want to use an unflattering term, because the man's extremely intelligent. He has a bit of a, how should I put it, a bit of a dry personality, but fantastic researcher. He works for AfriForum, and he did a study a few years ago, and he let me see some of his spreadsheets where he took the statistical sample and so on. And they were looking at how all of the main media houses cover various kinds of crime, whether it's rape, murder, robbery, whatever. And they took stats. He just takes a comprehensive sample of all of the crime coverage that all of these different outlets have done. And I mean, I think I can actually share this. Let me have a look.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Let me actually go and see. Okay, so at Marubane bias. Let's see what we got here. Because some of the data in the study was shared. Some of the data in the study was put into Ernst Ritz's book, Kill the Boob. So when they talk about media bias, it's really, really, really something. So what it says, the manner in which the incidents where the victims are black are reported to the media. Incidents where the victims are black and the perpetrators are also black tend to be largely ignored, 6 mentions per incident, while incidents where the victims are black and the perpetrators are white were reported on an exponentially more, with 75 mentions per incident on average. So you've got this thing, black on white, no one cares. Black on black, no one cares. White on white, people care sometimes. White on black, oh. So, I mean, there's all kinds of different stuff. I mean, this is the graph that I thought was really, really telling. So the reports, I mean, it's extraordinary. Mail and Guardian, he said that, when I spoke to him, he said that since 2009, they haven't covered a single case of black crime. It's only when white people attack black people. That's it. Extraordinary. This is the thing. SABC is actually more representative, than all of these papers. The SABC is the least anti-white publication.
And even that, I mean, presumably white on black crime is exponentially lower than all the other categories.
I know, but I mean, look at that. Look at that spike over there. Black or unknown on black. There we go. Black on white. There, 20%. I mean, they come close to being the most balanced. Citizens is also reasonably balanced. But it's like when you look at Mail and Guardian, it's like, yeah, no. Or ENCA. The New Age, there we go. The New Age and Mail and Guardian is more racially biased than the New Age. Do you remember the New Age?
God, how long were they around for? They weren't. They didn't stick around for
7 years. I think they were around for 7 years. For the fellows who's commenting in the chat, Evolve. That's not. We're not discussing United States FBI. We're talking about South African news media bias, very specific. So I mean, over here, IOL. I mean, IOL. Yeah, you don't need to gild the lily. We know what we know exactly what's going on there. I mean, Iqbal's survey, his financing is sort of backed up by ANC for purchasing the papers. And they pull it out of some poor feckless union who has to suck it up when he doesn't pay it back. But he's been absolutely relentless. He's been absolutely relentless. And whoever this Gulam guy is, he has been having an absolute field day watching. Because, I mean, this is now like the 6th or 7th time that he's been accused of being this guy or that guy.
The person that they accuse changes like almost every characteristic every single time. Like it's some white middle-aged guy, then it's an Indian woman. Now I think they're on like I think it's like a Muslim Indian stand-up comedian that they're saying he is.
And the poor guy doesn't even have political opinions, and he hasn't used Twitter in 9 years, and now he's getting death threats in his family because some mucho up at IOL thinks. And it's a pity because they bought out all of like the really great old Cape papers, so it's a big loss. So if we ever break them up, we get the Cape Argus back, get it be a normal paper again. Can you imagine?
Yeah, I mean the problem for the IOL is the fact that it's hoovered all of these smaller papers up, and then they sort of just have conglomerated into this really quite dreadful online publication.
They're trying to be News 24, and they're just like a little bit shit. Like News 24, I'll give them this. I'll give Naspers their due. They're very competent at what they do, but I wish they'd stop it. It's like Mail and Guardian and Daily Maverick. I mean, like you look at some of their research, their investigative journalist pieces, and you think, well, how did you get hold of that information? That's actually quite a good job. And then they write an op-ed, and it's the most awful drivel you've ever read in your life. It's almost as bad as trying to read Freya Werkblad. I mean,
but the thing is that that particular sort of way of doing business is very common now amongst major publications, where you use your investigative reporting and just like your general reporting to sort of build up credibility and expend all of it on these garbage opinion pieces and op-eds. Like some of the analysis is.
I mean, the thing is, like I think that I've gotten an okay grip on things in South Africa. I'm not the most perspicacious person out there, but I mean, for that I'd probably turn to James Mayberg, who, if only he wrote more. He writes like one piece every 2 months. I mean, Politics Web is but look at the little platform he's built up. They write very little, And yet every time a major politician wants to make a statement, they send a copy to Politics Web. Because that's how respected James Mayberg is. He posts like once every 2 months. But you got to listen to what's going on there.
Quality speaks for itself, you know.
Yeah, it
I
really
wish
does.
more publications would understand that.
No, it's hard. I mean, look, I try, but I mean, like, I'm churning out basic level newswire stuff daily when I get the chance. And then I try and match it with an opinion piece a day if I can squeeze it out. And that's, you know, it's essentially, like, I've done very few investigative pieces. I think the last one I did was, you know, actually with a lot of help from someone else, actually Ike Boss. You know, the stuff on garden route, you know, the 13 years of graft in garden route, and before then it was the waste to energy plant in Wellington here. And it's like, you do those pieces and they'll take up, you know, full time for a few days grinding, and you can't do anything else. You're just calling people on the phone. Excuse me, can we verify that's the case and that's the case? You know, and sometimes I mean, I've got so many of those stories I wish I could investigate, but you know, funding is what it is. Until the paper crosses like 10,000 views a month, unique viewers a month, then I'm gonna, you know, advertising is going to be what it is. But yeah,
big difference in resources compared to News 24 or Daily Maverick. I mean, News 24 is backed by NASPers, right? Versus, you know, local independent paper.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things though, while we're on the topic of analysis, one of the latest pieces we pushed out on the paper was my speculation on what the ANC's current strategy is regarding its political opposition. And I mean, we can see with the DA that they have been quite successfully contained. I mean, it's not like they have zero power. They have been given a couple of relatively high-profile portfolios, most significant of which is Dean McPherson's in Public Works, which we'll chat about in just a minute. But for the most part, they've been forced to swallow the ANC's entire program. The statement of intent leading into the Government of National Unity forced them to subscribe to the ANC's transformation program in its entirety. And they've stopped criticizing BEE. They are very much softer on national health insurance. They have come down to a certain perspective on matters which sounds, you know, to call them ANC light would be an understatement. They've agreed to implement the ANC's national policy. So essentially, the ANC has won a victory here by achieving the Government of National Unity, in that they've managed to contain all of their rightward opposition. Not only the DA, but also the Vryheidsfront Plus, who has been hidden away in prisons. Correctional services, while if you do a good job, you can do a lot of good, it's not visible to the public. Most people won't notice that you've done any good, you know? And only people who are kind of political nerds will pick it up at all. So the Vryheidsfront are sort of, as much as I support the guys, I suspect they may have picked the wrong option. Now, of course, you want to be inside the tent in order to get anything done, but there's a limit to this. If you are not achieving anything that you can capitalize on, it is best for your long-term survival that you retreat. Now, the problem is, do you wait until other people go first, or do you make a statement by retreating first yourself and join the opposition benches? Because if you leave too early, it looks like you didn't make a sincere effort. And if you leave too late, it looks like you panicked. So they are stuck up there. And I mean, the DA has the same conundrum to deal with as well, because they've invested so much into this project, and they see it as being a new system, like the coalition government system as being a new way of doing business, establishing like a permanent party cartel, and then becoming the biggest party in that party cartel that keeps all of the undesirables out. But that can only last so long because 2/3 of the population steadfastly vote black nationalist. So eventually, that slice of the pie is going to get bigger than yours. It's inevitable. The only way you can find that's not going to happen is if you end up getting the voter participation rates you see in Kailicha, where they literally physically attack IEC officials who come to register them to vote. So,
oh well, listen, if they manage to get it like that in the Western Cape, they've been speaking for a while about exporting the Western Cape to the rest of South Africa. So.
Yeah. Through voter apathy and alienation, it's a great way. So we can rule the country again just by making black people become very depressed. It's a great strategy, right? It's actually impressive watching how the voter participation rate falls, because it's nearing like only a third. It's below a third actually now of the voting age population who participate.
Yes,
it's really staggering. We have I think the lowest vote. We have amongst the lowest voting participation rate on the planet.
Yeah, and that's coming from it being extremely high for the longest time. I mean, at one stage, the official rate was like in the 90%. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, I think it was some 85, 90% in 94. It was really, really big. But what's interesting is that because of that effect of black voters leaving the ballot box, even as they grow as a percentage of the population, their political representation's flatlined. It sort of stays at 2/3, and then the minorities sort of the minorities and the shall we say contrarian black people. I'd say contrarian because you got your Zulu nationalists, you've got your UDM loyalists. Those guys are not liberal.
True.
Contrarian black parties, and then the liberals and the minoritarians together maintain that sort of 1/3 of the vote, entirely due to voter apathy. It's a time bomb. You're waiting for someone credible to stand up and say, actually, I've got a solution. But the second whoever that is comes around, it's toast for the minorities, I'm telling you. But in the meantime, we get an interesting thing, because I think people underestimate how badly Ramaphosa wants to take care of the RET faction. So looking at MK, they don't have to worry too much, because Jacob Zuma is the only person in the party who can hold it together for 5 minutes, or who can attract any kind of voter support. And he's 82.
Listen, if the US is anything to go off of, that age is just a number, okay? 80.
That's true, but he's not immortal. He is going to die,
Robert Mugabe died at like 94, These black nationalists, they use those witch doctors very well. It's actually quite
it makes me think of my there's a saying that was used for my one of my great grandmothers. It was said that she lived so long because she was pickled in her own vitriol, and you can imagine sort of Zuma is pickled in the bitterness of his desire for vengeance. He's not going to last forever. His children they don't share his talent and his grit.
I mean, his daughter can't even speak Zulu.
Really?
Granted, maybe she just decided for whatever reason to speak through someone, but I saw her using what very much appeared to be a translator at a completely Zulu country.
crazy. That's going to lose you. That's going to lose you tons of support. The other thing. I mean, look, those guys. Look, their strength is entirely with Zuma. So when Zuma goes, that the MK is gone. You don't have to do anything. You just wait for the old man to go. So that's gone. So what about the other half of the equation, the EFF? Well, the EFF are now facing decapitation. Because Paulie van Wyk has, she's finally gotten the last of the details and made them public. And she's been chasing this info for a long time. I mean, do you remember a while ago when I had that court case again opened up? So the criminal case opened up against what's that silly fella's name? The head of the party for the Western
Paulson.
Nazir Paulson.
Yes. Yeah.
I opened up a criminal case that hasn't gone anywhere really, but I mean, what can you expect? The police have other things on their hands, right?
They're too busy on everything else,
Very busy.
Very hardworking as well.
Yes. They tend to work a lot. So there is a problem there in that. See, the thing is, everyone's sitting here watching the EFF go down and cheering. And, I understand it's very entertaining to watch Dali Mpofu lose his mind in public, as he regularly does. But this time where something is at stake for him instead of just the usual theatrics.
This time it's funny.
Yeah, it's very funny. But Floyd Shivambu and Julius Malema are the only people who can run that party. And not even without each other. I mean, the two of them are really what makes the party work. So what's going to happen when they finally get prosecuted? Because the prosecution's coming down the pipeline. They're being investigated at the moment. And the real question is, what is going to happen when both of these black nationalist parties that offer a radical alternative to the ANC are gone?
I mean, there's really this is something I think I've already mentioned it to you, but this is something that there's not really a lot of historical. There's nothing we can look back on to try to figure out what's going to happen. I can't think of a single widespread populist movement that has just rapidly had all of its figureheads decapitated in such a rapid or potentially rapid time frame.
Well, I mean, you could look at the British Nationalist Party in the UK. I think because they actually went through a growth phase. They went through a growth phase, and I saw the tail end of that when I was living in the UK in Bedfordshire, and I ran into a lot of people who were BNP supporters, classmates who their whole family were BNP supporters and things, and then. Nick Griffin, who was running the party, he went on air and he said something that was in defense of Adolf Hitler, and absolutely just scuppered the party overnight. And not only that, but in the process, destroyed any possibility for a British nationalist party to get into parliament. So, and it's such a moderate label, nationalist, if you think about it at all. And yet now, anyone who talks about the British Nationalist Party is like, Adolf Hitler, Hitler. So they basically completely scuppered themselves, and there was no real political opposition until Nigel Farage came up. And I mean, Farage is basically Tory light. He doesn't take the immigration thing seriously. He's still talking about net migration targets and so on. He's not talking about remigration. He's not talking about anything like that. So if you take that kind of option, what you're really looking at the possibility of is that the ANC reabsorbs all of those votes again. Because no black most black people, I think like 90+%, really, really do not want the DA to run things. I think there are a number of people who kind of enjoy the idea of the Afrikaners being in charge of correctional services and things like that, right? But on the whole, on balance, the vast majority of people are really, really against this idea. And paradoxically, I think it's even worse that it's the liberals, because there's a sense that the average black person gets that liberals are lying to them and misrepresenting their true motives,
or even that liberals are looking to exploit them. If you're slightly more intellectual in those circles, then liberals are actually trying to implement this globalist regime to exploit black people.
Well, yeah, but the funny thing is they never use this term globalist. They have a completely different frame. They talk about like white monopoly capital. They talk about, Western imperialism, right? But it's the same thing that the right wing mean when they say globalism. And a friend of mine was pointing this out to me, and I thought it was quite an insight. He said that South Africa is actually it's actually one of the only places that you can live a first world lifestyle and be completely insulated from globalist programs. So, I mean, it's not strictly true. There's a fair bit of penetration in some places, but the black population are highly resistant to these mechanisms of control that you see elsewhere. And they're highly resistant to ideological programs like, the LGBTQ soup nonsense. That kind of thing is... He actually made a very strong point. And in a way, I mean, I've been thinking about this past few days, and I sort of thought, well, actually, there is kind of a symbiotic relationship. It's just a bloody uncomfortable one. So, both of us actually benefit from each other as racial groups. We really do. The trouble is that there's this constant desire to dominate. And being able to negotiate that space, it's actually very difficult, because it's just psychologically. I mean, obviously it's difficult to negotiate power in South Africa, but from a psychological perspective, it's difficult to negotiate, because you have to think, well, how do I make sure that I'm not giving away too much or too little, and so on? And which narrative do you pick in your mind? You can't go with like a pure universalist one, because that's not really the right approach. It doesn't fit South Africa at all. You can't go with a pure ethno-nationalist perspective unless you're willing to be very pragmatic.
Or if you're willing to have a civil war very quickly, depending on your specific brand.
I love I find it fascinating though, because you get so many right wingers that you bump into occasionally, especially young guys, and they really think that it can't happen soon enough. The crazy stuff can't. And I sort of think, well, do you really think we're ready for this? I mean, I understand. Yeah, it's like I understand that, broadly speaking, white armies perform much better than black armies in Africa, right? Given the same economic base, it's the same access to the same resources, we do much better. And given the same equipment, we shoot better, we navigate territory better, all of the above, right? On balance. However, we've still lost every war for a very simple and obvious reason. And I think that it doesn't matter how many great battles you fight and how excellent a shot you are. If you're losing the war, those are vain glories. So I think people should take.
It's not even just a wild thing in South Africa. I mean, really, if you determine your South Africanness by your link to the land, right? With the exception of the first Anglo-Boer War, the more South African group has lost every single war in this region's history. So,
yeah, it's depressing. So I think I mean, the thing is, if you do want to have any kind of long-term victory or any kind of serious thing going on, you have to actually build the base first. So this for me is the anchor time plan, but there hasn't been an implementation program for it. So it seems to me that it's a bit of a struggle. So anyway,
unfortunately, there needs to be, if you're going to go down the route of truly self-sustaining within the different communities. I mean, there's a very good video essay by Ernst van Zyl, who, having it be the time to dig trenches now.
he wrote that for I Am 1776. Mark Grunzer is a nice guy. He's running a very good shop there. It works out quite well. I mean, I wrote for when the riots in Durban were happening, they came to me to have something published, and I got really carried away because it was the first time a foreign publication came to me and asked for my input, and I dumped a 7,000-word essay on them. Which they edited down to like 1,500 words. Good for them.
They took one look at that and they're like,
but Aaron's built for this job that he's doing. He knows how to stick to a narrative and just slog. For me, I get terribly bored. I couldn't do his job. I get so bored doing this. I have to keep. He has to say the same thing every time, and he finds new ways to do it. Whereas what I find is, okay, but the target's always moving. The field of play is always changing. There's always a new challenge. There's always a new target, and I'm not a managerial type. I don't find it easy to fit into corporate hierarchies or anything. I make my living as a freelancer now, and in some ways it's a struggle, but in other ways it suits me better because I can focus on a whole variety of different things. And for example, one project that I'm joining at the moment is the VOC institute, which is it's about 30 years old. It's a sort of like a heritage focused thing in the Cape, and it's a lot of what you'd expect. Guys restoring old cannons and trying to fight for the preservation of statues and things like that. But it has an enormous amount of potential, and this is the kind of thing I like. It's not going to pay me a bloody cent, but it's something that that's the kind of thing I love getting stuck into. And as much as I'd like them, I'd love the money, and I clearly do. I'd give it a good try at Aaron's job if they gave me the opportunity. But I don't think I could do what he's doing. Not just because of the focus that it requires, but also just he has a fantastic work ethic. He's really organized. He's
incredibly focused. Incredibly focused.
It's the focus. I can't do it. I can't do the focus.
I think when you've built up your sort of whole media platform, really, like his whole persona online, and you work out the fundamental truths that you're really trying to hone in on, that you're really trying to project to your audience, and you just go in on it again and again and again, and you focus on innovative ways of delivering that message, as opposed, and that's where you get all the different things, as opposed to having like the really, it's like trying to.
Oh dear. Yeah, you've got no. The thing that we stick on at the moment over here, aside from
Sorry, I think Sorry, I think my internet dipped there for a second.
Yeah, I think I know what point you're trying to make. So you're saying that trying to constantly chase the ball wherever it's moving. For them, that if you're working in the sort of Afrikaner parallel government world, there's this single task that you're focused on at the moment. My criticism of them, and I was fascinated to find. So, if if you're curious, there's a channel that I used to run. The first time I tried to run a sort of online newspaper was something called the Young Cape. Now, the website's dead, but the old YouTube channel still exists. And that old YouTube channel has a number of interviews on them that I did with people. And there's one guy that I came back to a couple of times because absolutely fascinating chap. His name is Mansell Upham, and he's a historian that has an almost eidetic memory for early Cape history, to the point that he can tell you the entire life story of almost every person that lived in the first 50 years of the colony. Absolutely extraordinary. And I spoke to him again today for the first time in like 2 or 3 years. And no, it's I don't know. It's great. You need that. Well, you need guys at like that at the VOC, but I've completely lost my train of thought. Where were we? Oh yeah,
Yes, we were
chasing the ball, maintaining the thing. Yes, look, what they're doing over there at Solidarity. When I spoke to Mansell, he shared my perspective on this. Which surprised me, because none of his ideas sort of obviously line up. You think you're going to get like a really sort of obviously right-wing opinion here, and then it turns out, oh no, that one's actually fairly sort of left-wing and sentimental. And then you think you're going to get like a sentimental liberal perspective over here, and then you get like the most base thing you've ever heard.
I mean, that's the sign of either a reflective thinker or a complete schizo. So.
Right, and I was surprised to hear that he agreed with me on this, but he was pointing out, I was busy pointing out, okay, well, the one thing that frustrates me about the solidarity movement in AfriForum or whatever is that their project requires certain decisive actions that I've discussed with them, and I've discussed online many times. It's about how to implement the Anchor Town program. It's about, the kind of actions that are possible at the end of that trajectory, and the reluctance that they demonstrate, because the movement is very risk averse for fairly good reasons. They're risk averse. But it's not. I mean, it's frustrating from the outside, because you want to make sure, oh, why are you not acting? Everything's coming down. And I always think the worst thing that can happen is that you have a really good, lively stretch of economic performance in South Africa before it collapses, because that'll let just enough air out of the sails for your ship to sit still while you're being gained on by the other guy. And it's because I don't see prosperity, and I don't see a healthy society developing long term in South Africa without some kind of really radical structural readjustment programs, and without some really, really radical re-education changes to the education departments of primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And so if the system works well for like 5 to 10 years, that just lets the problems deepen and lets people get more and more complacent. Whereas what you really need to be doing is building those escape hatches fucking quickly. Now, you do need enough of a runway. You don't want things to change too quickly, but you don't want things to get too good either, because there is no long-term scenario in which this country really works out. without the complete
Or
transformation.
even if in a case of economic prosperity, depending on depending on who exactly is prospering the most, what you really don't want is that these incredibly radical groups are suddenly also quite prosperous and have deep pockets to pursue their agendas.
Correct. I mean, one of the things that people forget is that in the lead up to the French and Russian revolutions, you actually saw a massive increase in the standard of living of many, many people. You saw massive economic growth, economic mobility, and so on for about a generation. And, Russia was industrializing so fast that they were considered to be an emerging rival to the Western powers, even to the United States. There was some talk around the time that Russia might eventually eclipse the United States. They were developing their industry fairly well. That was all smashed into 1917, and the communists couldn't do a damn thing with what they were left with until Standard Oil and General Electric came to build their cities and their power plants and their factories for them. So yeah, I mean that's my favorite historical detail, is that little irony that the Soviet Union was built by General Electric.
Well, that's the thing in the Soviet Union. Obviously, the early economic investments, but even after, or even during and after World War II, there was so much lend-lease and like developmental aid from the US, and you would never think that this is supposed to be your main rival.
No, it continued after the war. This is the reason Anthony Sutton was kicked out of the Hoover Institute, is that in one of his books, he actually publishes evidence that Wall Street was financing Russian military manufacturing to send onto the other side of the Vietnam War while the Americans were fighting it.
We do love our giant multinational corporations. They are really quite special.
Sneaky shits. You never know what you're going to get. I mean, the famous actor Armie Hammer? His grandfather, Armand Hammer, same, as we call him, Armand, if you run into a person with that name here. No, he was a financier of the Communist Party when in its early days. You get a lot of these sort of wealthy industrialists who believed in communism, and a lot of FDR's brain trust were Bolshevik sympathists. Of course, some of them were also fascist sympathists. The general idea being that by establishing monopolies, you gain control over the huge sectors, very favorable to you personally, but also there was this idea that it allowed more efficient organization of the economy, this sort of central planning system. And America persists in this way. I mean, there was a recent study demonstrating that the electrical vehicle market in the United States being handed over to Elon Musk has not resulted in greater efficiency. The Chinese are starting to have a massive, in the words of one of the commenters, a Cambrian explosion of companies punching out electric vehicles. So we may well see some good things coming out of China in that regard soon. But it's not always the most efficient model. But its one benefit is that it allows you to get onto a war footing much quicker. But I mean, China's compensation for that is, of course, the massive controls the state has, so they can just mop up all of the little industries and gear them towards a war economy very quickly.
China is in complete control of its private industry, so I don't think the concern for that regard is too great for the Chinese.
Yeah, if you're in the right sector, you have to have oversight from the military or some such government sector. So they sort of have this unified planned economy mode in waiting for any given economic or political crisis. So
even in some industries, I know it's mandatory that a I can't remember whether it's a controlling share or whether it's a largest voting bloc of the worker union of that company. So if you're an industrialist, it might be the case that your company has to be like 30% owned by the workers' union, and every workers' union in China is part of the industries union, which is part of the Communist Party.
Yeah, but I mean, you have a similar model here. What's really interesting, and I've been looking at this recently, is that the first foreign political party with which the Chinese Communist Party formed a formal relationship with, for sharing ideas of governance and so on, is the ANC in 1998. So, and it's funny because when Mandela came to power, he actually took a neutral stance on the One China policy. He said, "Well, we're going to deal with both Taiwan and China, and you guys are going to have to play ball." And then he gets superseded by the end of his administration. In 1996, they were forced to change their position. And now, I mean, our proximity with China is extraordinary. But I thought, I'm still boggled at that because the level of involvement is extremely fine. There's actually partnerships between various cities and provinces in China and the provincial governments of South Africa. So they're not just cooperating at a national, but also subnational level.
Yeah, I mean the Chinese investment in Africa has, I know, for up until maybe 2018 was quite alarming. How they were going around building all these infrastructure plans, saying that you basically don't have to pay the debt back. The
Well,
investment
no,
in South Africa is quite
the thing is,
reminiscent of that.
people look at the statistics wrong. So their loans to African governments peaked in 2016 and then fell off a cliff. And what happened is that they shifted so they realized that African states are financially vulnerable. Duh. They don't follow up on their agreements. Duh. So the Chinese took a while to catch up. The Americans, for some reason, haven't figured this out, and they're still dumping money into African governments, probably because they actually do play the debt trap game very well. But what the Chinese have done is they've backed off from loaning things to African governments, and they have pivoted to private sector capture. So they pitch up, they put up their little colonies, they export their factories. I mean, there's a major plant here in the Atlanta Special Economic Zone, which Alan Winde designed specifically to develop the electronic vehicles and solar panels market. But the Chinese have taken advantage of that because people he wants to show up didn't show up.
Yeah, I mean, even in KZN, I think there's a plant right by Newcastle. I think I wish I could remember. I think it's a textile plant, and everything I hear about the Chinese investments in KZN make me think that for all these very strong worker unions and whatnot, they seem to have a very big blind spot for all of the Chinese investments.
Well, I think what it is that we forget that there are loopholes. And so in this country, if you employ someone for less than 30 days, they are a temporary employee. So they use temporary employment services. So you get these subcontractors that rotate workers very quickly. The problem is that then, of course, none of the workers are particularly skilled with any of the jobs they're performing, but they're disposable, fungible commodities. So you just rotate them out. The actual workers' unions that you do have to deal with, they tend to be extremely incompetent. They're not good at bargaining. So if you've got decent representation at the bargaining councils, you can push these guys around very easily. So it's because they'll make outrageous demands, and then all you have to do is show that you've actually done some basic paperwork, and they'll get shafted by the bargaining councils, who, generally speaking, are actually a lot more fair-minded than people give them credit for. Even despite the legislation actually giving them the benefit of the doubt. So, strictly speaking, the burden of evidence, the burden of proof, is always on the employer under the Labour Relations Act in a bargaining council. Whereas in any kind of normal thing, there would be, preponderance of evidence. If you make a claim, then you have to demonstrate it. But instead, you can accuse your employer of anything under the sun, and they have to prove that they're innocent. It's not a reasonable system at all. And then you've got these extension to non-party clauses that mean that if you, Section 32, the Labour Relations Act in particular, if you strike an agreement, you can extend this agreement to the entire sector as defined by the minister by fiat. I mean, he doesn't have to justify his decision. He can just say, well, this is the sector. This is what the sector is. And we extend the agreement that you guys have struck over here to the entire sector, whether or not those employers and unions have even taken part in the labour bargaining process at all. And this is, it's really shocking. It allows industry cartels in various sectors to strike backdoor deals that are unaffordable to small companies and shut them out of the market. This has worked very well for the mining sector. It's working increasingly for the metalworking sector. There was a big bargaining agreement that went down, and groups like NEASA, who represent these mid-sized groups, there was a point where there was the temporary threat that they would actually just choke the bargaining councils to death by refusing to cooperate. Because if they all refuse to cooperate with this bargaining agreement, there simply isn't the bandwidth to process all of the complaints. There's such a backlog over there. I mean, they could have paralyzed the entire bargaining councils if they could get organized enough. But the trouble is, how do you organize 100 small businesses? There are very few places that this can work. I mean, the farmers' protest in the Netherlands is a very rare exception. So, trying to get small and medium-sized enterprises to cooperate. So, yeah, you can see how that works.
I mean, that's a running theme in South Africa. All of our institutions are massively backlogged, and then we have this complete disconnect between the sort of, I use the term sparingly, but the sort of organic economy that exists at the lower levels of South African society versus these giant institutions, giant companies.
The oligarchies have a natural advantage in organization. I mean, for everyone else, it's a coordination problem.
Yeah, and it's completely dysfunctional, that sort of middle ground.
Right. So, I mean, where we need to get to is a position where people are capable of organizing in their own self-interest collectively. But this remains the ultimate prize, is managing to get the minorities to organize, effectively. Well, forget the minorities in the private sector. This is my very sort of awkward segue to the second half of the topic, the second half of the podcast, which I wanted to discuss, which is, what is Dean Bloody McPherson doing? So Dean McPherson has been very good in clearing up a lot of corruption that he spotted and wasteful expenditure, and this has been the headline since he took power. But the problem with the public works and infrastructure office is that now the DA has no excuse for their problems at the provincial level, because they have both the national office and the provincial government. They can work in perfect synergy. They can lay any infrastructure they wish. So what they need to do is, fix everything. The dams need to be bigger because they're bursting at the seams now the drought's over, right? So we had 7 years of extremely lean, horrible drought. And then the last couple of years have been sort of fairly normal, and now we're getting big rains again. We need to get behind this, and I have experienced the rough end of this personally because, as I explained in the last podcast, I have a sinkhole in my driveway because the retaining wall extending from the culvert under the bridge next to my house has not been maintained since it was built in the 1930s.
The municipal government has personally gone out of their way to give you a pool, and you're just complaining about it,
Shucks, I hadn't seen it that way, silver linings and all. I just, I just, walk out there when I'm taking out the garbage and I stare at the roots of the tree that are dangling down into the black pit. But it's it's a fairly shocking experience because you watch these cracks in the soil marching slowly towards the outside wall of your house, and you just think, oh shit. Because I can't get to my storeroom that has all my books in, and I'm thinking, how long is it going to be before my first edition copy of Kotkin's biography of Stalin is floating somewhere in the Krumra feed,
Unfortunately, I think for the DA, for the longest time, they've, like you said, been hanging on to this excuse of dysfunction at the highest levels. They have the municipal government, the provincial government, and they control the relevant ministry. This is what the DA was promising us forever, and what they promised us going into this government of national unity. They now actually have to deliver. Like the goals of the DA are no longer these like nebulous ideological sort of, we want to push the narrative
federalism and liberalism and free markets and non-racism.
I want to see a DA hat with his shovel digging up the water overflow trenches and whatnot. I want to see them actually engage.
I specifically want to see three things in this regard, and there's a second area that McPherson can touch on, that's where there's a very simple fix that's extremely transformative. And I wrote a whole piece on this, and I'll come to it in a minute. But the first one in fixing the rivers is, reforesting the floodland areas and doing slum clearances in floodplains. You have to do that, right? You have to do that. Now, if you want to go into providing housing, build a flipping high-rise. Put the people in the high-rise. Just get it over with. I'm sure some developer would love to get the contract. Okay, and the DA love their property developers. What needs to happen in these floodplains is they need to become forested. That is how you secure yourself against soil erosion, against the rivers cutting too deep. It slows them down. It reduces droughts. There's all kinds of benefits, right? Just plant the native trees. Because the thing is that they've cottoned on to the fact that the old growth or the sort of old invasive species that we all imported from Australia 200 years ago, or whatever it was, those are absorbing so much water that I think they account for 30% of the loss of water in the province. It's something obscene like that. And they're starting to get a control on it, but they can't just have it be barren. This is the problem. You need that sort of hardier local growth, and there are several plants. We know that there used to be yellowwood forests all across this province. There used to be all kinds of indigenous trees. The problem is our local trees grow very slowly. And so nobody has the patience for this. And the invasive species grow very quickly, and no one has the patience to constantly deal with them. Now, they do have a budget for it now, and they're making some headway in some areas, but they really need to do a proper survey of this. Second thing that they need to do is deal with deep water channels in rivers that run through residential areas. Now, I wasn't aware of this until I discovered it by accident. I went up and down the river by my house one weekend in October. Marching down the river with a Yorkshire billhook in hand, cutting away foliage like some bloody jungle explorer.
Tapping into your roots there.
Oh, indeed. And the thing is that when you get just after my house, like upriver, there's no need for it because it's until very recently it was cutting mostly through farmland. But downstream from my house, after the weir that runs off at the end of my property, there is the start of a deep water channel, and it's about this wide. You can't see that on the channel. It's about 2 feet wide, should we say? And I have no idea how deep it's supposed to be, but there's walls that run all the way down to the end of the river where it joins the Krommerivier. And this is filled with silt. No one has dredged this in a million years. No one has retained the concrete barriers that keep it sealed against erosion. And it strikes me that, it's very obvious the volume of water that flows through here during the winters. And we have flood season every year. There are floods every single year. There's no excuse for this, right? And it's across the province.
It's a surprise every time, though. We never expect it.
Everyone's shocked. Oh, climate change. No. Crisis preparation, my friend. We know that it's coming every year, like the fires that come in summer, like the drought that comes in summer. Prepare. So the one problem is that the dams which keep our water reservoirs through the summer, they're actually bursting the banks now, right? And they're having to let water out. And I look at this and I go, well, why don't we prepare for the fat years and take advantage of them? Why don't we build higher dams? Why don't we reforest the land around the dam area so that the water's retained? There are things that are just not done, and just the simple maintenance of stormwater infrastructure. You watch what Jordan Hill-Lewis has been doing now that he's got a slightly freer hand. He's been removing people who are squatting on top of stormwater outlets and things like that. Like, okay, good, that's great, that's excellent. And you cleared them out in the months before flood season? Holy moly, first time anyone's done that. But it needs to be much more comprehensive because at the moment it's just the city. This needs to be a province-wide issue. And the DA have most of the municipalities in the entire province, and they're not doing this, right? And now they've got the National Department of Public Works behind them. They need to be hitting this like, they need to be on it like white on rice, but they're not, and it's painful.
I think especially this isn't even specific to this issue. This is a sort of general grievance that I have with the way that or the missed opportunity that the DA keeps insisting on, which is this like real lack of coordination between the city of Cape Town and every other municipality in the Western Cape.
Yeah, because there are advantages that come from, because look, the legislation allows you to actually share what's it called, revenue between different government bodies. So if there's a budget gap that has to be filled because you have a low capital base in some municipality somewhere in the province, you can share that little bit. And for example, if you wanted to get the police independent, one of the things you can actually have the powers to do if you're in charge of the province is you can establish municipal police forces. So then you can establish a metro police for, Breedevallei. You can establish one for Groot Karoo. You can do all of that. And then where they need a stopgap filled, you plug that gap with revenue from Cape Town, from George, in a higher taxpayer area. This is not done for some reason. I don't understand it. There's another thing that they could have been doing since 2011 when they came to power, and Jacob Zuma responded by organizing a deal with the Cape gangs that has been enforced by the South African Police Service, because he placed Becky Cele in charge. Thank God the man's gone. Funnily enough, now you're starting to see the gangsters actually get prosecuted. Haha. But what Alan Winde could have been doing in the meantime, and I suspect he might have done it if I know him at all, is using the special prosecution powers, the special investigative powers that the Premier actually has. His office has powers of investigation. So you can set up a special commission that investigates the local SAPS branch. He has the power to do that, right? So he could have busted a very, very severe form of corruption that's been causing thousands and thousands of deaths in this province. They haven't done that. They could have been devolving electricity from 2009 already. They haven't done that. And it's just over and over again, this thing of refusing to take powers that are just like the lowest hanging fruit. And speaking of low-hanging fruit, the other thing that Dean McPherson has in front of him, and I don't blame him for not knowing this, because it's a fairly obscure piece of knowledge, is that the reason that our roads and rail are shit, and of course it's due to the ANC, let's not pretend it's not, but the problem does start sooner. And I'm talking about the 2020 report into roads and rail by the Brenthurst Foundation. Now, the Brenthurst Foundation argue that we should do nothing, and the private sector should just cope by pouring more freight rail onto the roads. But they buried the lead, because they do this whole thing which is like slightly defensive of the ANC, of course, because they're part of that clique of oligarchs who regularly do business with the ANC, so let's not ruffle feathers. But the lead that they buried is that the reason that the rails have been declining since 1977 is because the government removed the weight limits from road trucking. And because they do this, there's an interesting thing. I could only find this on a very obscure article by some Chinese American nerd for like an obscure trade publication. I couldn't find a fucking academic source for this. It boggles my mind. There's the relationship between axle weight and road surface damage. The relationship is to a power of 4. It's the most extraordinary exponential relationship. So you can drive 1 million family car transport vehicles over the road, and you can't see any damage. You drive enough 18-wheelers with, iron ore on the back of them, and your road looks like the surface of Mars, like this huge pitted, cratered, This is the thing, is if you remove those weight restrictions, then you get all of the rail freight, all of the stuff that used to travel by rail goes into the road, right? And it damages the road, and the taxpayer pays for the road. If that's moved to the rail, then you have rail tariffs that the transporters have to pay, and that goes to rail upkeep, and rail is much more resilient to these forms of damage because they have this, they're on rail, right? So you don't have this sort of complex broad surface that you have to constantly maintain and repair. No, you just run it on a piece of steel that just goes grrr.
Also, that's exactly what it's designed for, as opposed to a lot of roads, which is designed for just regular cars.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you can't actually design a road that's for resisting high volume, high pressure, freight traffic. I mean, the expenses would be astronomical. So what you've got a perverse incentive built into the very nature of infrastructure. You've got no regulation on road freight. And look, okay, the ANC is pissing money away like nobody's business. But I mean, if you have enough water pressure, you can fill a colander, right? And this is what I'm getting at, is that it's a flipping simple fix. All you have to do is reintroduce, and look, I know, Dean McPherson, you're not in charge of establishing tariffs on road. That's all Transnet, right? but you're a national government now. You got to talk to the big boys and help them out. Okay, so this is a really trivial fix, a really, really trivial fix. I mean, look, okay, people don't like e-tolls, but e-tolls were actually an attempt to patch this problem, because how are you going to pay for all of this damage? South Africa has the most extensive road network in the world relative to its size, I think. No, I think it's like it's like, but it's in the top 5 anyway. It's really got one of the highest, one of the most extensive road networks, because it's a very large country with a sparse population. So you've got this huge road network, and you've got these heavy trucks running everywhere, donering the place up, and you've got a bloody incompetent government. And the least you can do is make sure that the structural economic incentives are equitably distributed, so that they don't externalize the costs, right? You distribute the costs according to which parties are contributing to the damage to the infrastructure. And it's very simple to do. Just put a weight cap. You don't even have to do any kind of like complex targeting stuff. You just say, oh, does your truck weigh more than X? Get the fuck off the road. You know, it's very simple. And if they did it like that...
The question for that will have to be, is the rail system, because it's gone through this whole period of really quite horrific decline. If you did introduce a weight limit, presumably that would have to be in conjunction with some sort of revival of our rail system.
Well, that's just the thing. It's you because you've now created the necessity for transferring your intermodal transport to the rails, right? You create a revenue source that you can now, a captive revenue source, no less. You can just impose tariffs on them, right? And those tariffs, they don't even have to be much, right? But what they do is they immediately finance the restoration of the rails. I mean, that is a really, really leaky serve. That is a real colander, because you've got all of these mukhus who've turned themselves into an industry stripping the rails. The quick fix for that one is that you make it easier to run to monitor the scrap metal dealerships. I actually looked into this a while ago, but I can't remember what they did to them. I can't for the life of them. They changed something that made it really hard to run a small scrap metal dealership, but also really hard to monitor the large ones. I can't remember what it was. It was some kind of arbitrary standard that really allowed the Zuma family to scoop up a lot of them. I have to look at it again. There are a lot of these like weird little structural things that people don't look at because it's boring. I mean, who gives a damn about scrap metal dealership, like scrap metal regulations and so on? Road freight.
It's like a massive underground industry in South Africa.
No, but I mean, it's like, everyone thinks about like the crime enforcement. Yeah, okay, crime enforcement, law enforcement is the first line of defense. Absolutely. So it's something that, you really, really need to get a grip on for anything to function. But in the meantime, there's so many holes you can plug, so many little holes you can plug, and they're easy to plug. People just don't do them. And now that the patronage network that supported those regulations is gone, why are you letting them persist? You're just letting your enemies keep milking the system for graft. Plug the holes.
I wonder whether there is fear of non-compliance within the existing bureaucratic structure.
Absolutely there is. I don't doubt it for a second.
How do you tackle that without...
The way that you do that is you look at the organizations that facilitate non-compliance and you work with them. I mean, like OTA, for example, that organized the e-tolls protests. If you introduced like truck weighing stations, that doesn't affect too much of the population. It only affects a certain amount. And, you can just walk up to them and say, listen, this policy is very sensible, doesn't impact the average taxpayer. It's just an industry standard in order to distribute I don't think the guys at OTA would be particularly obstreperous if they got that, especially now. I mean, all of those guys now believe, GNU is probably for the best, let's play ball. I look at this kind of stuff and I think, okay, how do you actually get the big boys to pay attention to policy reforms like this? I mean, I know Magnus Haystack follows us. So the question is, well, does he read it? Does he think about this? Because the Prentice Foundation they're not small players. If they press the right button, someone's going to listen. This is the Oppenheimer family we're talking about. No one ignores the Oppenheimers, the biggest political donors in the country. So
multiple parties.
Exactly. So who doesn't want to grab onto a quick solution? It baffles my mind. I mean, look, I understand cleaning house is the most important thing, but there's so much policy, so many little policies that can fix things without having to reinvent the wheel, because we're doing so many stupid things. That's what it is. If you're in Denmark, how do you fix a problem? Well, you have to be very, very savvy, because it's gentle tweaks to a very complex system that's already running very well, right? You're talking about refining a Ferrari there, right? You come to South Africa and you've got like a rusty old Skadonk with 6 holes in the engine. Like, the fixes are easy, my friend.
Well, that's the thing. That's a problem that I think sort of is endemic to South African politics. I think most South African policy gets spoken about and gets implemented as if we're already some sort of highly functioning country. I think the first person in like real leadership positions in this country to just sit back and say, most of our roads are broken. Very little actually functions the way it's supposed to. I think we need to prioritize getting the basics right. I think only then will real structural fixes, those sort of easy things to get done, will actually really be considered. Otherwise, we're just like we speak about our tax reforms and what we allow to be imported or exported and whatnot, as if we're like these very serious global competitors. Like if we allow secondhand vehicles to flood in, then our it will kill our automobile manufacturing sector. But
But it doesn't, because we're making. What are we doing? We're manufacturing the German stuff for us. I mean, honestly, what we really need is cheap Japanese things. Because I'll tell you what, the Japanese, where, like, so my sister-in-law's got the car that, we share with them, right? And that car comes from a guy, the one importer in Namibia who deals in Japanese cars, and his name is Jan Japan. Because we have, you can't get Japanese vehicles in South Africa in certain categories, right? So there's like some Suzukis you can't get, and there's some Hyundais you can't get, and so on and so forth. Not Hyundais, Hondas. Sorry,
I just gotta hear that. I'm just gonna hear that again. The guy who imports Japanese vehicles is named Japan.
Yeah. Well, it's not his real name. Everyone calls him Jan Japan.
Okay.
Once you go north of the Olifantsrivier, no one uses their real name anymore. They're also always, Cookie and Lolo and fucking.
Well, very few people live there as well, so I'd also start making up things to keep myself entertained.
Exactly. It's like everyone's called some kind of nickname. They don't go by normal names for people living in the big cities. So no, but Jan Japan is. So he's a massive import. He makes a lot of money. And the thing is that a lot of South Africans also will go up to Namibia, buy the Japanese second-hand vehicle, come down over here, and they'll have like a Namibian registered vehicle that they then get registered in the South African system. because it's completely against import regulations. But I don't know. It's like a loophole, a de facto loophole, right? Because you're not commercially importing them. You're just like, this is my car. Can I drive it over the border? Yeah, sure. Okay, now you're inside the country. Can I recognize my car? Yeah, it's a valid car. So,
Yeah, our border officials are, I mean, the stories that I hear are absolutely horrific of them trying to implement these very, strict import regulations. Like, for example, for textiles, right? There'll be some sort of limit where it's like you're not allowed to like price gouge, or you're not allowed to bring in textiles below the like at ridiculously low prices to try flood the domestic market, right?
yeah, no,
And
there's very reasonable anti-dumping mechanisms.
yeah, so we are basically anti-dumping, right? And it will be something like, well, it can't be at more, so it can't be less than like 10 rand per kilogram. And for the most part, 90% of the time, the price of the textiles will be determined via the sort of, I mean, it'll basically be determined by what the person who's importing it says it costs. So we're not price dumping because we said we're not price dumping. Product
Yeah,
dumping.
yeah.
And that's basically the extent of like half of our, again, supposedly very strict import regulations.
Yeah, but I mean, you're making me think of Temu now. So Temu come in, and they're doing the Amazon thing where they're loss leading, except they've got the Chinese government's money printers behind them back home, and not only they're doing a loss leading internet retailer in South Africa, they have a system for circumventing SARS by tailor making at the individual product level the customs rating for them. So they'll like assemble collections of items here in South Africa and call it a product, and the thing is that SARS literally doesn't have the manpower to audit this. So the
I mean,
no,
this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, it's like nothing actually functions, but we set
and yet
these
on the other hand,
regulations and everything, yeah, as if they do.
and yet you go the other way across the border into Namibia or Botswana, and those people will look you over with a fine-tooth comb, like you're infested with nits. If you've got a little, fet planky on your back window and you drive into Namibia, you will get stopped, and that thing will be chucked out faster than well.
Yeah, unless you want to camp right on the banks of the Orange River, otherwise no one stops you if you try to do that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, they have this big thing about invasive species, and then on the other side, taking plants out. They're big on poaching. So the customs officers on the Namibian side actually take that thing very seriously, and they'll give you a ludicrous fine.
I mean, it is a giant desert. I would protect my very few plants tooth and nail as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Botswana also has a fantastic, reputation for policing their borders. I think part of it has got to do with the infrastructure they inherited since the deal with De Beers after they got their British protectorate status to prevent roads getting in there. They've always had a very serious approach to smuggling of any goods, and even when dealing in the old days with whether they're dealing with the national government, the ANC, or whatever, they pretty much carved their own path in terms of how to deal with cross-border issues and so on. And they're generally very good at preventing smuggling, human trafficking, anything like that. And they know their shit. What I find funny though is I've never been to Botswana myself, but everyone who goes, they have this interesting perspective where everything works and everything's clean. But if you try and get anything done and you're in a rush, people will not cooperate with you. And that is just there's something uniquely African about that, which I can't explain. But it's like even when they're doing their job really well, they cannot abide to be rushed.
Yeah, the way it was explained to me was it's it's still pretty undeveloped. Things are clean, people are friendly for the most part. Things work, but it's basically like just a nice version of South Africa for the most part.
Yeah, well, you got a lot of like white and Indian businessmen over there.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean,
especially the ones that came from Zimbabwe.
no, but it's tempting as well because shit. I mean, Gaborone is right across the border, or as they pronounce it, Haborone. So there's a funny thing where if you learn Setswana in South Africa, like you've got they use so all of Setswana uses the spelling that was developed for the dialect that's spoken around Groot Mariko, which is the Bakwena dialect, right? And this was standardized by Saul Plaatje, who is one of the founding members of the ANC. The problem is that in Botswana, they use the same spelling as we use on this side of the border, but the G, F, and the G's and the F's are become H's. So it's Haborone, and instead of Fela, it's Hela. Like they turn everything becomes sort of soft and delicate, and it's
Maybe that's why they sound so friendly. You
yeah,
feel
maybe it is.
serenaded every time you speak to them.
Setswana in South Africa always sounds like they're about to kick the dog, whereas you go north of the border, and they all of a sudden sound like they're about to make you a gentle cup of tea. But what I find hilarious is also the level of admixture of Afrikaans that you get in Setswana over here. And one of the funniest things I ever saw was, so I worked on a farm in Northwest where they were selling citrus and whatever, and you'd have retailers come down from Botswana to buy the citrus, and you'd get these young women come out, and one of them was very, very attractive, and so the farm workers were like, Mosade, and so they go over there and they decide to chat them up. And the minute he opens his mouth and tries to speak this very guttural southern Setswana dialect with Afrikaans words mixed in because he thinks he's gangster, so he uses the mengsel. And she just hosed herself laughing, like she was in tears at how bad his language quality was. And I couldn't keep myself together. It's funny. So I mean, like I am.
Yeah, that's funny. That's actually true. They probably think of themselves as like the sophisticated, real Setswana dialect.
Right.
This is probably
Right.
some country bumpkin sounding Setswana.
No, it's like when but the opposite applies in South Africa, where the guys who speak the broken urban dialect think themselves sophisticated, and the fellow who comes from the sticks who speaks this immaculate, deep Xhosa or Zulu with no loan words in it, and perfect grammar and good manners and everything, and then they look like, oh, what, you actually like speaking proper, what? Don't come here with that. We speak like this in the city. We're hard, we're urbanized, and I think that's in a way it's kind of
cosmopolitan.
no, it's kind of pathetic. I was like, don't you have any pride in expressing yourself in an eloquent fashion? I mean, it's not like I don't use Afrikaans loanwords from time to time, but it's because sometimes something is expressed better. But for the most part, if you cannot express yourself in your own language, what are you doing? I mean, it's like in Afrikaans as well. It's an absolutely frustrating thing if you're trying to have a conversation, and I will occasionally lack words. Okay, my vocabulary lacks academic language and things like that. So and sometimes I'll even forget a very common word for a very obvious item. and people switch over to English, or more irritating, they'll start speaking Mengels, like not, and like you won't even initiate this. They're just like, or I know someone who actually struggles. Afrikaans is their first language. They struggle to speak proper Afrikaans. And this is not someone without. This is someone who's doing a university degree in Afrikaans, no less. So, like, what the? Why? How are you like this?
Listen, the neo-colonialism extends to the English language as well. Okay, we have been very good at enforcing our language on everyone else.
Well, we were the best. Our ancestors were the best colonists. So.
Exactly. We conquered the whole world so that we don't have to learn any other languages. We do it out of courtesy to other countries, okay, and to other people.
The Spanish tried, but they went native too quickly, I think.
Yeah, exactly. They lost their touch.
But it's funny, there was a period in time where Latin America nearly actually became literally Latin America because there was a certain wave of missionaries who chose to teach the natives Latin to speak to them instead of Spanish.
Yeah, that is.
Can you imagine a world in which
in
which Latin America spoke fucking Latin? Can you imagine that?
It would be very interesting.
It would be a crazy world. Crazy world.
They would be even more of their own civilization as they are now, which is.
Yeah, and the Russian Orthodox Church reached Alaska before any other Christian denomination.
Alaska was Russian for a while.
There's a potential world where the Inuits speak Old Church Slavonic. There's like a possible world. I do love that kind of stuff. It's a pity we didn't have more interesting versions of that here.
The English the English colonial project was unfortunately, not unfortunately, probably.
We got tired of winning. We got tired of winning. That's what it was.
The English colonization of Africa was so successful, and they took this sort of laissez-faire. We're not going to like impose our will too much on the locals. Unlike the French, who were just like.
No, I beg to differ. I think the thing is, the French really believed in the whole sort of liberté, égalité, fraternité stuff. The English sort of thought, well, look, we're here. We have to deal with you. We would prefer that you play by the rules, which means doing whatever the hell we say. But we don't really want you in our house. So that's the English approach. And I mean, people forget that separate development started with Theophilus Shepston's governance of Natal.
The British colonial project was, weirdly enough, it was a completely different structure in the settler colonies compared to everywhere else.
There's a remark. So the South African Communist Party came up with a certain phrase for describing the system in South Africa after 1928, and this has been adopted as the mainstream perspective. So they refer to the old system in South Africa as being colonialism of a special type. If you ever heard that phrase. So you get this idea that at the core you've got these white settlements, right? And they constitute the colonial metropole. And then you've got the Bantustans that constitute the colonial periphery. Now, there's a very famous philosopher called Nick Land, who in what was once his most famous book, but is now sort of just like an old reminiscence of his old way of thinking. It's called Fanged Noumena. In his opening chapter of this book, he makes exactly this observation, whether he's read the South African communist literature or not. He makes the observation that South Africa is like the world recapitulated in miniature because white South Africa, 1989, remember? 1918, and then he goes from this and he's saying that the inevitable conclusion is that the barriers will be removed. No one could have known at that point that South Africa was ending unless they were part of the inner circle of the Nationalist Party. It took absolutely everyone in the world by surprise when de Klerk removed all of the boundaries in 1990, the next year. But the year before, he's going, well, the logic of capital demands that the barriers be lifted. Much like the end of colonialism has initiated a chain migration system from the former colonies to their old metropoles. And this hasn't, when he was writing this, it hasn't even become like a serious problem yet. And now it's absolutely overwhelming Western Europe. And I think those little observations are easy to overlook. I mean, you can become a victim of your own success. One of my favorite things to notice is that at the very point, I don't have hard evidence for this, but I really strongly believe it, that if you find any system that you find the moment that they have really peaked in the intensity of the expression of their supposed ideological form, that's the point at which they're about to collapse. So you look at Victorian England, this big jingoistic thing. Just after the Victorian period, you get something like the Boer War. By the time the Boer War comes around, you've got absolutely the height of imperial arrogance and everything. This is also the moment that you've got people coming out of the woodwork like Hobson and all of those who start crying about, humanitarian aid and sort of mistreatment of the natives and, unjust war and all of that. You wouldn't get that. You wouldn't get that in the 18th century. No one in Britain would even contemplate that kind of thinking. But right at the height of imperial domination, you get that a lot. And the Americans are very interesting as well because they have a similar model. Nobody gave a toss about how brutally they subjugated Haiti. But you get to the 1990s and they've got full spectrum dominance in every area of the globe. And all of a sudden they're talking about humanitarian intervention as an excuse for their benevolent governance. And at the same time, an absolute explosion of left-wing pressure on American foreign policy from within. So, yeah, I think, same with South Africa, the 1980s, balls to the wall, we're the most hardcore, super, apartheid, but also at the same time, we are reasonable reformers and we're distributing resources between the races and, that kind of thing. So you get these.
Yeah, this was P.W. Botha's whole thing. He would. It rings a bell, but I think there may even be a specific Afrikaans term for this. But this whole notion of speak like a reformist whilst ramping up the repression, that was sort of the go-to for.
Yeah, no, everyone was very disappointed in his Rubicon speech, and but everyone wanted everything to end immediately. The reality is that the reform started in 77. And if you listen to Herman Khileomia, they were talking about it in 72, 73, right? So, although if actually considering the events, it probably was only from 73, because that's when the general mining strike, the coal miners strike in KZN was. So that would make sense. But it seems like everything's sort of in its twilight years. The Chinese have yet to enter their truly arrogant stage yet.
Yeah, so, I also think maybe just in terms of this, what we see as like a shift to it being sort of like more compassionate, more humanitarian. I mean, you could also just interpret it as them realizing the system is coming to an end, so trying to cover their asses and try to paint it a bit more favorably when you go back and look back.
I'm not so sure that's exactly what it is. I think it's just sort of you get a flip side of the coin when you sort of say we are the greatest and most benevolent, instead of just being and you use that as your justification, you're naturally going to attract criticism on on the grounds of your benevolence. Whereas if you're simply saying, well, we want that, we're going to take that, and no, don't you do that because we don't like it. There's the whole sort of vainglory that is attached to that kind of the later stage of it isn't present in that, because there's just sort of, well, what are you doing? This is sensible, and this is how we're going to do things. What are you talking about? So early 20th century South Africa, it's like, oh well, look, we need those shiftless natives to come into the mines, so poll tax, and
I mean, it is quite remarkable how much criticism you can avoid just by being very blunt with your engagement,
Well, the thing is, you could also be fortunate enough to live in a world where no one cared. So, I mean, who's going to criticize South Africa for those practices? No one. Not a single person. When Jan Smuts was high-stepping all over Europe, attending all the conferences, I mean, no one accused him of hypocrisy.
I mean,
So,
everyone was also engaging in it, so.
No, exactly. And so, I mean, it's funny that he gets buried by the very system that he helps build, because all of this human rights stuff and global government stuff, they look back on South Africa and go, well, South Africa is the flagship project of the United Nations. And, a demonstration of how the world can get together.
And then very quickly derailed off that course.
That's why they don't like talking about it overseas, because it invalidates the entire program that the global regime is based on. It invalidates everything. So,
I mean, you could even maybe make the observation that the early Afrikaner nationalist shift is sort of maybe an early echo of sort of a more nationalistic, anti-globalistic, populist shift that we're seeing now.
No, but it's quite right. They aim for an autarkic government in some sense. And the thing is, we had the resources to actually come close to that. But it's... If you're sitting on minerals that are vital to the balance of trade internationally, you do not want to step on the pipe. And foreigners like to be assured that the spice will flow indefinitely. And so the ANC have been very cautious with how they play with this. I mean, look, when Herzog threatened to nationalize the mines, the Oppenheimers threatened to blow them up. That's where we were. So, I mean, not entirely without self-interested reason, but we're dealing.
I wish more companies would act like that in South Africa nowadays. Oh, the government really wants to try to screw over this industry. Oh, we'll just destroy everything and leave.
Imagine that you own 2/3 of the entire mining industry and you were backed by JP Morgan. Do you think that you would pussyfoot around such discussions?
No, you almost have a responsibility not to.
Yeah, but I mean, the long-term consequences of the mining monopoly have yet to be calculated in this country.
Yeah, well, there's a great argument in terms of where the power base or the legitimacy of a ruling government comes from, and things like monopolization of private industry or even mass immigration can shift power away from the voting population to essentially consolidate it into something that's a bit more controllable. If most of the economy is things that are not determined by the electorate, then you can start ignoring the electorate. At least as far as
the electorate exists to be ignored. I mean, one of the things that we learned early on from extending franchise to women is that nobody votes when everyone can vote. So Oklahoma learned that in the middle of the 19th century. So this is one of the things that the leaders of the world have known since the democratic revolution to the 19th century rolled through, is that the more you expand the franchise, the less people actually care, the less actual informed opinions matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's sort of builds off of. I'm sure you are familiar. I know the French aristocrat philosopher Alexis Foucault, I think. He made the observation that the electorate it is remarkably unremarkable. It almost, when given power, gravitates everything towards mediocrity and
Correct.
uh,
Lowest
and really
common denominator. Absolutely
averages
correct.
are predictable.
You look at how people are discussing Donald Trump's assassination right now. What's going on there. You've got so many posts that people are criticizing where everyone's going, well, I never wanted to vote for Trump. I was very much against him, but now I can't help but feel that, there's something to the man. And you're like, yeah, did you think about his policies at all? It was like, there's a very bright guy on Twitter who had a little thread about his mother, saying that his mother doesn't care. The reason that she hates Trump is because he's mean to women, not because he has policies that will detrimentally affect the state of the republic, but because he's mean to women. And you're like, these are the people that are deciding your future. You think that the average voter is like you, who has thought very hard and very firmly about, obviously this is the right choice because they have these policies and these people and they have these hiring practices. Not a damn.
Yeah, I think it was a Winston Churchill who who quipped that the best argument against democracy was a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
Yeah, no, the thing is, but he also played that sort of weaselly little game with his quotes where he went and said, "Oh no, it's the worst system except for all of the other systems." Yeah,
Oh yeah,
except the thing about democracy is it's the only system that absolutely guarantees the destruction of civilization. Now, every other system risks it, but democracy guarantees it. And that's because you increasingly compete over the distribution of free stuff.
yeah. I mean, this is, I know, especially amongst sort of social Darwinist types, the argument that in a democracy, if and presumably in a democracy, people will vote to give to those who cannot produce for themselves. And in such a system, you're sort of incentivizing that those who cannot produce for themselves still remain within the system, still contribute to the system. And in a normal system, in a sort of evolutionary system, those people would eventually be cut out of the system because they can't contribute to it. But if they
You may say
can,
that, but
yeah,
I mean, one of the things that I know, one of the things that more interesting things I read recently is a book by a man called Joseph Tainter called "The Collapse of Complex Societies." Now, of course, democracy plays something equivalent to democracy plays a role in many of these societies, But the reality of it is that, as he puts it, society simply just gets too complex for any sort of group of people to actually manage. And at that point, you can't actually correct course because you have no idea what's going on. And I think we've reached a point like that very very recently, where there is some emerging, there is emergent order for sure. But if you wanted to course correct at this point, what would you change? There are a lot of things that will break very, very badly if you change them. I mean, I sort of think of the Soviet Union, where you get this total collapse of civil society for a good decade. And Putin has taken ages to turn it into a relatively ramshackle success. So okay, they've got clean streets in St. Petersburg and so on, but yet it's a fantastically inefficient and corrupt government by Western or European standards. But you're getting this from like this massive collapse in the 1990s from just trying to fix obvious problems, like the obviously stupid problems, trying to fix those. And you think you can untangle the Gordian knot that is Western liberal democracy and try and course correct without collateral damage? I don't think so.
No, well, that's why I think, like again, going back to this whole social Darwinist, this whole social Darwinist theory, the idea is that if you don't course correct by essentially not just sustaining an infinitely growing population, then you're going to have the situation where people are voting essentially to not work or to not be productive, not add value to society. And I mean, it's very difficult to sort of examine the reality of such a thing that would presumably happen over hundreds of years. But it's interesting if if it's too difficult to course correct on that sort of thing, then you almost have to divide and conquer and figure out, well, what parts of society are still structured in a way that they're quite resistant to the sort of negative sort of left-wing rot that is set in a lot of
But
Western
that's kind of a
institutions.
fundamental problem, is that in that process, you have to create winners and losers, right? And you have to ask yourself, are the replacement patronage systems that you're setting up actually resilient to perverse incentives? So, for example, in Russia, they tried to they democratized the businesses and distributed shares, and then a certain clique of internationally connected oligarchs financed the buyouts of every single sector of the economy, and then used it to secure extractive relationships with the taxpayer base. So, and enforced their dominance through armed gangs that were connected to police infrastructure. So, it's just what can you really expect to happen in a society in free fall during a radical experiment in reform? You can expect absolute balmy nonsense.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
I wonder. I mean, it's very difficult to know for sure, but especially in Russia, this sort of aversion to Western institutions just on principle. Sorry, my laptop is cut up there for whatever reason. But this, I don't know. There does. I mean, if I have one criticism for the sort of radical reformist right wingers that are sort of gaining prominence in Western countries, is that they seem to not be totally convinced of things that have very good track records of working, and are, I think, maybe a bit too reminiscent of the sort of leftist ideologues that are very keen to just take a hacksaw and destroy a lot of things that have worked pretty well despite their faults. I think you
I
have
think
to be
the hard part
very
is that,
careful.
yeah, I think I agree with you. I think one of the problems is that there's this imagined scenario they have where if they press the right buttons, they'll get people to return to tradition. And I think the scary thing people are going to realize is that the return to tradition is based on religion. It's based on a spiritual engagement with a common core. And we don't have that anymore. And once you pull the plug on the material life support, you have no idea to what sort of voices in the darkness the general population are going to turn. So, and it's very, very hard to control. So you don't know if they're going to turn to, race, or whether they're going to turn to Christianity, whether they're going to turn to something new that hasn't been recognized, whether they're going to turn to Islam, And in South Africa, I mean, we sit here and we go, okay, but we are forced into the pragmatic mode because there is no common, ethnic. There's no ethnic commonality. There's no common culture. There's no common ethnos, should we say? And for the Afrikaners, they have a sort of stable idea in mind, but that stable idea also involves a Western middle class existence. So there is a degree to which people who are facing these kind of hard decisions may or may not be, I don't know, they may or not be tackling the problem head on. So yeah, I mean, on that momentous note, I think it's time that we call this a night.
Yes, unfortunately, I don't think we'll solve all of the world's issues and usher in a new age of traditionalism on tonight's podcast.
Well, jeepers! I mean, I don't think anyone's prepared for taking that task on, not in the slightest. So for now, we can say let's fix trucking and and flood management.
A far more manageable goal.
Yeah, if that even can be achieved. Anyways, good night and good luck.
No.